everybody. So we're going to go ahead and go over the gendered homophobia and contradictions of workplace discrimination for women in the building trades. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so really this project, the researchers aimed to examine how female identifying persons experience male dominated workplace environments, specifically within the building trades. As expressed on page 382, they argued that the presence of women in male dominated jobs threatens the perception of this work as inherently masculine. In discussing distinct gendered homophobia occurring within these trades for queer and lesbian women, the authors aim to show both resistance and coping strategies utilized by tradeswomen for how they engage with or tolerate their work dynamics. The goal of their project was to show how masculine, really the definition of building trades as man's work, and individual tradesmen's heterosexuality impacted tradeswomen's work dynamics and how the women handled these intense interactions with their coworkers. In doing so, they discussed the plethora of consequences and distinct contexts that tradeswomen, both queer and straight, felt. Their goal with this article was really to show how agency was limited by the ways the women became isolated. However, this focus seemed to be lost by an overarching conversation about the ways gender and homophobia were linked in particular ways in the gender. However, the ways in which they were linked in particular ways in the building trades. They draw on research, a research project done by one of the authors that was 63 interviews done by participants recruited in a kind of snowball sample. So in other words, they interviewed somebody and then they knew somebody else they could interview, and they kind of found interviewees that way. These interviewees had a diverse range of age, job title, and experience within the participants, and 35 identified as straight and 34 identified as white, with the remaining racial demographics. The remaining racial demographics of the participants varied. So some of the ways assumptions of women's sexuality as queer allowed for gender conceptualizations that were molded in ways to conform and become included into masculine understandings of work, and also confronted with homophobic responses. So instances of this included using homophobic slurs to refer to other men, and determining all females that worked in these trades as queer, and desiring to be male, thus utilizing that compulsory heterosexuality by equating lesbians as females wanting to be men in order to gain access to heteronormative sexual encounters with women. Butch presenting lesbians became understood as one of the guys in ways that allowed them inclusion in some situations, but only if they can or chose to engage in and tolerate misogynistic speech and interactions with others. These women were also asked to consistently prove their physical capabilities within their jobs. Straight and feminine presenting queer women sometimes engaged in homophobic language and discrimination in order to get in with the male white tradesmen. Disclosure of queer identities were managed depending on the safety and risk associated with outing oneself. Strategies included keeping it private, open closet door policy, keeping them guessing, or breaking the stereotypes. So really it ranged from this one end where they were keeping it completely to themselves, to the other end where they were an open book. They had these other two kind of were more in the middle, which was more like keeping them guessing. So I'm not gonna say yes, I'm not gonna say no, I'm not gonna deny my identity, but I'm also not going to reinforce this idea or openly share it. And then breaking the stereotype being that idea that well, I can meld in with one of the guys and or I'm going to break down the stereotype of what you have as a lesbian or whatever in your ideology. Race impacted these situations greatly, though, as white supremacy created increasingly hostile situations for persons of color, especially women of color. For women of color, disclosures and compounding it with queerness created and added hostilities at work. In other ways, queer sexuality threatened the individual notions of heteronormativity that were part of the original ideas of what men specifically understood, or how they understand these building trades work. So in doing that, they evoked their conceptualizations of masculine embodiment, which resulted in gendered misogynistic interactions. In these interactions, men sexualized or fetishized queer women by redefining lesbian relationships as serving the male heterosexual desire. Tradesmen neutralized their perceived threat of lesbian desire to heterosexism. So in other words, they're taking something that was to be considered going against that heteronormative relationship between a cis man and a cis woman, and they're taking the relationship between two cis women or two women to be the object of male desire, so that way it doesn't butt up as much against this idea of, well, but you're still trying to do this. And or they made it so that, well, one of you is trying to be a man anyway, right? So they're trying to disconnect that idea that homosexuality can be equal to that heteronormativity, right? Or that heterosexual relationship. The authors describes one form of, by redefining lesbian relationships as serving that. Okay, so we talked about that. The authors really described one form of resistance to the forms of sexual dominance as turning the tables, where women utilize similar techniques of male dominance to counter the men they work with. In doing so, the women engaged in their own subjectification of women that they were with or that their coworkers were with. So in other words, like they would make comments necessarily about their coworkers' wives or girlfriends or what have you in very misogynistic terms in order to kind of go back at these men, or to deal with that constant threat onto themselves that they were feeling. And so in order to really kind of get into that in-group as well. So not everyone could engage in those behaviors. Some were subject to sexual harassment, sexual violence, and assault. One of the biggest findings in the sections was the limitations and almost inability to collaborate or to find solace in other women in the trade. As described here, tradeswomen effectively use their specter of lesbianism to stymie gender solidarity and political activism. So these women weren't really allowed to engage with other women, because when they did so, it was promoting this idea that they were lesbian. So if they weren't, and or if they were in the closet or trying not to perpetuate some of the harms that came from being out, it really came down to like the idea that, well, okay, then I can't really be seen with other women, because if I'm seeing with them, then they're going to say I'm hitting on them, or they're going to call us all a bunch of lesbians or what have you. And it really made forming kind of like these women's unions type ideas, or these women getting together to really promote some kind of change in the way they are treated. It really disconnected from them from these opportunities in very real ways. And so really that kind of goes through some of the things I really want to talk about. I really want to hammer in. I really want to talk about the fact and drill in, if you're really going to get anything out of this lecture or pull anything away, how race really impacted their safety, how race really impacted their ability to engage in any form of in-group activities with their peers. Also how homophobia really was central to this idea of how these women were treated, right? So it was consistently about whether or not they were gay, or even if they weren't, making them as such, because being gay in this context was assumed to be wanting to be male, which is the only reason why you would want to be there, because this is men's work. So it didn't threaten their ideology, the men's ideology of exactly where it is they would want to be, or exactly why it is they were there, or what their work was, right? So really, that's kind of the key points of this article. I'm going to go ahead and log off again, and I will see you again shortly for our next article. I hope you all are having a wonderful week. Bye, everybody.